So, how should children be learning in school? To answer this question, we need to start with an even more fundamental question. How do children learn? So, I'll start with a bit of a metaphor and then we'll get into the science and the psychology of it. So, there's this famous quote that education is not the filling of a vessel, it's the lighting of a fire. I think this beautifully captures the shift we need to bring in terms of how we do education. Because children are born with this fire, with this natural drive to learn. Even if you look at little infants, they have such a strong natural instinct. They are constantly exploring the environment, interacting with objects, with people. They don't just sit around like empty vessels waiting to be taught things, right? No, children are wired to be curious and self directed. So there's this famous book called Drive by Dan Pink where he asks the following question. Have you ever seen a 6-month old or a 3-year old who is not curious and self directed? That's how we are out of the box. If at age 14 or 43 we're passive and inert, that's not because it's our nature. It's because something flipped our default setting. Now, what could that be? Any guesses? The traditional system looks at kids as empty vessels to be filled with this standard generic knowledge, and this totally works against their natural drive. It kills the fire within them. Learning something is one of the most rewarding, exciting, and fulfilling experiences, right? But in the schools of today, kids don't feel excited or fulfilled. They actually feel bored, stressed, and frustrated. Why? Because their natural drives are being suppressed instead of being nurtured. But the thing is, human drives are not so easy to suppress and they come out in different ways. And we've all seen this, backbenchers secretly playing games, someone's looking outside the window, or someone's just doodling. But of course, each of these behaviors is called out and punished. We call that classroom management, and so much time goes in that. I think the best example to truly understand the power of this natural drive is when we think about learning a language. That's one of the hardest and most complex things a human needs to learn in their life. But it happens so easily and naturally, right? How does a little toddler pick up their first language? There are no classes, there are no lectures. At some point, the natural drive kicks in, and it's all fun and games and play. And just like that, in no time, they've learned one of the most complex things that a human needs to learn. Now, compare this to a new language you try to learn in school. It feels so hard. It feels like so much effort. It's not very much fun. And after years and years of effort, most of us still can't speak it fluently. Of course, one explanation is that our natural ability to learn a language fades with age, but I think this still illustrates very well the power of the natural drive, which is just exponentially superior to the kind of top down, forced learning happening in the schools of today. So, what we want to do in an ideal system of education is to leverage this natural drive. In fact, we want to build a whole system of education around this natural drive. But first of all, what is this natural drive? How does it really work? And what's the best method and environment to unleash it? That's what the rest of this video is about. In order to understand this natural drive, we'll turn to by far my favorite book on education. It's called Free to Learn. It's written by Professor Peter Gray, who is a developmental psychologist, which means he specializes in the psychology of how children learn and develop. So honestly, this is the only scientific field when it comes to how children learn. And the insights that he's going to share are going to challenge everything that you thought about education and even parenting. Now, before we get to that, we need to understand a bit about this field called evolutionary psychology. Now, what is that? Evolutionary psychology takes the perspective that in order to understand human drives, we need to understand our evolutionary past. We need to understand the environment in which we evolved. Humans haven't changed much biologically for 60,000 years. So many of our instincts and drives make much more sense if we look at our past and our evolutionary environment. For example, human beings have a natural instinct to eat a lot of sugar and fat. Now, today, this instinct leads to all kinds of health issues. So that begs the question, how come this instinct even exists? Because it's clearly doing us so much harm. But if we look at the evolutionary environment in which these instincts evolved, it starts to make much more sense. You see, fat and sugar were very difficult to find in our evolutionary environment where we lived as hunter gatherers. In that environment, if you found any fat or sugar, you just went for it. You would eat as much as you could because it was very rare to find. But it's not rare today. In fact, it's very easy to manufacture. But because we have the same instincts, it's getting us into trouble now. So, now how is this relevant to education? Well, we are trying to figure out how our natural biological drive to learn really works. And to understand this, we need to turn to the natural environment in which this drive evolved. Because as we saw, the instincts haven't changed and the biology hasn't changed much for 60,000 years. So, looking at our past can give us big clues into how the drive to learn really works and how we are wired to learn. And once we understand how we are wired to learn, maybe we can build a whole system of education around that. So, in evolutionary psychology, whenever we want to do such an exploration, we turn to the hunter gatherer tribes that exist even today. That's our best chance for understanding our evolutionary environment. So, in the book Free to Learn, Peter Gray takes us through a beautiful journey into the lives of hunter-gatherers and their children. Hunter-gatherers live in tribes of about 50 to 150 people. The tribe has some sort of camp where they sleep at night. Now, the adults of the tribe spend most of their day hunting or gathering. So, they leave the camp to bring back the food. But what are the kids doing? They spend most of their day playing. But here's the crazy thing. Everything that the kids need to learn in order to survive and thrive in this very challenging environment, they learn through play. And when you observe these children playing, you start to realize that they're learning a lot of things completely through free play. Children are tracking and hunting, using bows and arrows, building huts and tools, mimicking the sounds of animals, learning how to climb trees. So, pretty much everything that's required for their kind of lifestyle, they are learning through play. These tribes believe that at around age 4, children can reason and control themselves and no longer need to stay close to adults. And then these kids start seriously hunting and gathering only when they're about 16 or 18. So, from age 4 to 16, they are just playing. And they're doing this almost entirely by themselves without any adults because the adults are out to hunt and gather food. And Peter Gray is quick to point out they do all this because they want to. Nobody tells them that they must, nobody tests them, no adults try to direct their play. Their guide is their own free will, their own instinct, their own natural drive to learn and explore. So, this is really interesting, right? Because in today's world, we tend to look at play and learning as two separate things. But if we look back at our past, we start to get a very different picture. And we start to realize that somewhere we're not understanding the importance of play. But what is play? Now, let's go deeper into the evolution of play into its very roots. Are humans the only species that play? No. Anyone who's had a pet cat or a dog knows that they like to play too. Well, it turns out that all mammals have this instinct to play. But the same instinct is not really there in reptiles. So, all life forms other than mammals come into this world with fixed instincts. They just repeat the same behavioral patterns over and over again. But mammals come into this world with flexible instincts. And these flexible instincts are shaped through learning and practice provided by play. Play's purpose is to promote skill learning. And you can actually predict what an animal will play at by knowing what skills it needs to survive and reproduce. Lion cubs play at stalking and chasing. Zebra and other herbivores play at fleeing and dodging. Monkeys play at swinging from branch to branch. So, when we look at how mammals develop, it's very clear that play is learning. Play is the natural way of learning. So, here's the picture we have so far. For all mammals, play is the primary way of learning and skill development. Of course, humans are also mammals. And when we look at hunter-gatherers, again it becomes very clear that everything that the kids need to learn in order to survive and thrive in this very challenging environment, they learn through play. And in the case of hunter gatherers, the children are playing and learning almost entirely by themselves without much adult intervention and with almost complete freedom. Nobody is telling them what to do. They are playing and learning purely by virtue of their natural instincts and their natural drives. So, now coming back to the main question, we wanted to understand how the natural drive to learn really works and how we can create an environment to harness this natural drive and to unleash it. And all of Peter Gray's research points in a very clear direction of kids having a lot of freedom and a lot of play. Children are designed by nature to play and explore on their own independently of adults. They need freedom in order to develop. Without it, they suffer. The drive to play freely is a basic biological drive. Lack of free play may not kill the physical body, but it kills the spirit and stunts mental growth. Free play is the means by which children learn to make friends, overcome their fears, solve their problems, and generally take control of their lives. Nothing that we do, no amount of toys we buy, or quality time, or special training we give our children can compensate for the freedom that we take away. The things that children learn through their own initiatives in free play cannot be taught in other ways. Peter Gray puts forward a very clear thesis on how children learn. I'll just put it out there first and then we'll analyze it piece by piece. Children are biologically predisposed to take charge of their own education when they are provided with the freedom and the means to pursue their own interests. They bloom and develop along diverse, unpredictable paths, and they acquire the skills and confidence required to meet life's challenges. So, Peter Gray is saying that children are wired to take charge of their own education. All they need is the freedom and means to pursue their own interests. And when they have all this, they will develop along diverse and unpredictable paths and acquire the skills and confidence to meet life's challenges. So now let's take this piece by piece. Children are wired to take charge of their own education. This is the natural drive that we keep talking about. Children come into this world burning to learn and genetically programmed with extraordinary capabilities for learning. They are little learning machines. Within just their first 4 years, they absorb an unfathomable amount of information and skills without any instruction. They learn to walk, run, jump, and climb. They learn to understand and speak the language of their own culture. And with that, they learn to assert their will, argue, amuse, annoy, befriend, and ask questions. All of this is driven by their inborn instincts and drives, their innate playfulness and curiosity. Nature does not turn off this drive when the children turn 5 or 6. We turn it off with a coercive system of schooling. So, this is so crazy, right? We know that children are learning these extremely complicated things like walking and speaking a language, all completely by virtue of their own natural drive with 100% freedom and autonomy. So, this is how we are wired to learn. We are not wired to sit in boring lectures all day long. And the second premise is what they really need is the freedom to pursue their own interests. Freedom and autonomy are going to be the biggest themes in this video series. Frankly, I got into education because my schools took away my freedom and tried to control so much of my life, and I had so many problems with that. So, we're going to talk a lot about freedom. And once they are in control and have their freedom, children bloom and develop along diverse and unpredictable paths. To me, this is the beauty of life. We're all good at different things. We have different personalities and interests and perspective. And then we learn from each other. We depend on each other and we achieve all these amazing things as human beings. And when you look at how human beings develop, it's so obvious that each person is different and totally unique. But our system is completely standardized. It seems to completely miss the very basic point that each child is different. So let's reiterate the main arguments of this book. Children are wired to biologically take charge of their own education, and what they really need is the freedom to pursue their own interests. Now, there's another big argument in this book, which might be even tougher to digest. In such an environment, Children ask for any help that they may need from the adults. There is no need for forced lectures, assignments, tests, grades, segregation by age into classrooms, or any of the other trappings of our standard compulsory system of education. All of these, in fact, interfere with children's natural ways of learning. Of course, this is hard to digest, but it should really be no surprise given that the traditional system has gone so far in the opposite direction to all of this. And now you can begin to see why education today is so boring and stressful because it's working against the natural drive. So, what if we designed a system of education around freedom and play? What is Peter Gray's ideal school? Peter Gray believes in the system of education called democratic education. This concept originated in a school called Summerhill, which is in the UK, which started around 100 years ago actually. There's this incredible movie made on Summerhill. I would highly recommend that you watch it as it gives you a real flavor of democratic education without having to visit an actual school. Peter Gray put his own son in a democratic school called the Sudbury Valley School in the US. So, this is by no means just an academic exercise for him. The system is called democratic education because, just like in a democracy, citizens are free to do whatever they want. In a democratic school, the children are free to do whatever they want. Nobody can tell them what to do. And they also get to vote on important decisions. To visualize the Sudbury Valley School, you have to set aside all your notions of what traditional schools look like, including your notions of what progressive versions of traditional schools look like. Sudbury Valley is not a Montessori school or a Dewey school. Schools of those sorts may be more in line with children's natural ways of learning, but teachers still run the show. Teachers in those schools still get students to learn a pre planned curriculum according to a pre planned schedule, and they evaluate the students along the way. Sudbury Valley is something entirely different. To understand the school, you have to begin with the thought: adults do not control children's education, children educate themselves. Students are completely free to move about the school or the 10-acre campus. They're not assigned to some space or some batch, and there are no grades. There are some adults in the school, but they are around just in case a student wants them. In fact, the students get to vote every year on which adults they want to keep at the school and which adults they don't want anymore. Now, this is the most critical part. The adult's role in a democratic system is completely passive. They are there in case the kids need them. They're not supposed to teach. Not just that, they're not supposed to implement or impose any of their own agendas. Like, oh, I want the kids to learn about this or that. No, it doesn't matter what the adults want. It only matters what the kids want. So, this is the key shift. I hope you realize that the schools of today are 100% adult controlled. And that's a big problem because in these systems, the children have 0% control and 0% freedom. Coming back to Sudbury Valley, you may be thinking, so do they have classes or what? Classes are offered when students request them, but nobody is required or even particularly encouraged to join a class, and many students never join one. I always hated class, so this sounds so good to me. So the first democratic school, Summerhill, started in 1921, and over the last 100 years, there have been many democratic schools popping up all over the world. I've been fortunate to spend some time in a few democratic schools in India, and they've been by far the greatest experiences I've had within a school building. Quick shout out to Arohi in Bangalore. It was so beautiful to see kids be truly free, and it's so unfortunate that I had to travel thousands of kilometers to even see that. Once I spent time in these environments, I was totally convinced about Peter Gray's main premise that children are wired to take charge of their own education. That if we just give them the freedom, they learn everything that they need to learn in order to be successful in today's world. I hope it's clear by now that there is no curriculum in these kind of schools. Forget about curriculum. There's almost no mandate at all. Nobody can tell kids what to do or impose their own ideas. The kids easily pick up the basics of math and language, and then they move on to all kinds of advanced stuff based on their interests. I've seen kids making motorized boats, learning foreign languages, and doing all kinds of stuff, all the while being totally free, playing, and having a lot of fun. And we even had the fortune of attending some alumni events at some of these schools. And the people that we met were totally fine, successful in their own fields. And again, this should not be a surprise because the system that we have today is somewhere in between, mostly relevant to entirely useless. So if you don't go through the traditional system, I genuinely think you don't really miss out on anything meaningful. And you gain so much. Not in terms of test scores, but in terms of social and emotional development, in terms of understanding and channelizing your own interests and passions. As I mentioned, Peter Gray sent his own son to Sudbury Valley School, and being a scientist, he's actually done a lot of research on the graduates of this school. 75% of the graduates pursued higher education, which is much higher than the average for the US. None of the graduates complained about having any difficulties adjusting to the formal structure of college or employment. Peter Gray was quite surprised by this because the moment you do something very different with children, the question pops up about how will they adjust. But when he dug deeper into this, the graduates explained to him that their decisions to continue their schooling or to work at particular jobs were their own, that they enjoyed what they were doing, and that they fully recognized and accepted the fact that these pursuits involve certain regimens that must be followed. You see, the kids are much smarter than we give them credit for. And they were all very glad that they went to Sudbury Valley School. None of the graduates said that their life would be better if they had attended a traditional school rather than Sudbury Valley School. All of them indicated that they were glad or very glad that they had attended Sudbury Valley rather than a more traditional school. So there you go. Nobody felt that they missed out. Nobody felt that they couldn't adjust. So nobody felt that there were any drawbacks to going through this radical system of education. But what about the benefits? The authors of the study put the benefits into four categories. The graduates were much more responsible and self directed. They had much higher motivation for further learning and work in their chosen careers. They had unusual depth in terms of their skills and knowledge in the fields of their interest. They had a lack of fear of authority figures and had much better relationships with adults. A majority of the graduates attribute their success to the skills, attitudes, and values they acquired during their years at the school. So let's pause here to reflect on this. Let's revisit the main thesis of the book, that children are biologically predisposed to take charge of their own education, and when given the freedom, they develop beautifully along diverse, unpredictable paths and acquire the skills and confidence required to meet life's challenges. There is no need for forced lectures, assignments, tests, grades, segregation by age into classrooms, or any of the other trappings of our standard compulsory system of schooling. The results from Sudbury Valley School are proof that this is really true. And it's not just one school. I can personally vouch for a few other schools in India, and I've seen enough to have no doubt that this is true for all democratic schools. You can trust the kids to educate themselves. You really can. The kids that graduate from these schools, they can read, they can write, they can do math. That stuff is really not that hard. What's really hard on the kids is this forced system of education where they have zero control and freedom. I know it sounds crazy, but you can literally throw out of the window everything you know about school, and the kids are going to be just fine. There is no need for any of this. Of course, with the one condition that children need other children. That's a huge part of their learning and development. And for all of you who might be feeling nostalgic and thinking, hey, I loved my school and what's so wrong with it? Think about all the great times that you had in school. And I can bet that most of them had to do with your friends, with other children, and not so much the system and not so much the adults. And let's talk a bit more about play and freedom. Peter Gray really changed my perspective on play. I used to think of play as fun but kind of a waste of time, and I used to draw a very hard line between play and work. But honestly, I've started to see that at the highest level of work, when you're being extremely creative or focused, that has a lot to do with play. So, play is not just something that kids do. The state of flow, where you lose track of time, also has a lot to do with play. In fact, many of the scientists who have made the greatest discoveries talk a lot about how they accessed their inner child and were in a state of play when all the magic happened. So, play is something much, much deeper than what I used to think. There's been a ton of research around this, and the fact is that learning, creativity, and problem solving have so much to do with a playful state of mind. And they're actually inhibited by the pressure to perform or achieve an external reward. Specifically for children, play helps at such a deep, deep level because playing with other children away from adults is how children learn to make their own decisions, control their emotions and impulses, see from other people's perspectives, negotiate differences with others, and make friends. So, some of the most important social skills in life are learned through play. This book is a lot about freedom. In today's world, we seem to think that the onus of education lies with the adults. But it wasn't like this till a few hundred years ago. In fact, throughout human history, as we saw with the hunter gatherer tribes, the onus of education has always laid with the children, and it still does today, in spite of school. The school system has created this attitude that children learn and progress primarily by doing tasks that are directed and evaluated by adults, and that children's own activities are a waste of time. What we're learning now is that it's the other way around, right? Children's own activities may look frivolous, but that's actually where all the magic is happening. Dozens of studies have shown that when people choose to perform a task, they do it much, much better than when they feel compelled by others to do it. When compelled, they tend to do the minimum necessary to meet the requirements. Does that sound familiar? Now, this is a really, really big point for me. I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I'd go as far as to say that you don't really learn something unless you want to learn it. So, if you don't want to learn something, you are never really going to learn it. So, it's no surprise that you don't remember 99% of what you learned in school because you didn't really want to learn it. And the 1% that you do remember, that's the stuff that got you interested. That's the stuff that you wanted to learn. And this means that wanting to learn something is literally the most important factor in learning. So, why not shift our focus entirely to what each child wants to learn? What's the point of forcing them to learn things that they don't want to learn? Of course, there is always this one counter argument to this, which is how do they know what they want to learn? Don't we need to expose them to things? These arguments somewhere make the wrong assumption of how a child's mind really works and how children really learn. Again, filling vessels versus lighting fires. When you speak to a little child, there's always so much going on in their brain. And today, there isn't really a lack of inspiration or stimulus. So it's just a question of trust. Do you trust that they'll really figure it out? But as Peter Gray says, when given the freedom, they will develop along diverse, unpredictable paths. So, the most profound conclusion we can take away from Free to Learn is that you can really trust the children to drive their own education. And in fact, if the adults just completely get out of the way, it seems to lead to a much better system of education. So, for adults, doing nothing at all and trusting the kids to figure it out is a much, much better strategy. We're just too full of ourselves to realize that, and our egos get in the way of accepting that. But I hope these insights help us understand the truth about how children really learn. Now, in this last section of the video, I want to talk about a few chapters of the book which were critiquing the traditional system of education. Honestly, I've tried my best to avoid ranting and criticizing the traditional system in this series because the point of this series was to be constructive and to build something new together. But there were some really interesting insights in these chapters, so we'll quickly touch upon some of them. There's this really powerful TED talk which makes the argument that schools are not built for learning. When people are asked about what conditions lead to the best learning, this is what they come up with. But then what we're doing in schools is the exact opposite. So, what's really going on? If schools are not built for learning, then what are they built for? Of course, Peter Gray has an answer to this question, and he argues that instead of authentic learning, schools are focused on measuring performance. So it's learning versus performance. It's lighting fires versus filling buckets. In Peter Gray's words, today there's an ever increasing focus on children's performance, which can be measured, and decreasing concern for true learning, which is difficult or impossible to measure. And this one quote sums it up too well. Children are pawns in a competitive game in which the adults around them are trying to squeeze the highest possible scores out of them. The more you think about this, the more you realize that something else is going on. Education is more about measuring performance, about comparing yourself to others on some arbitrary metrics. It's more about signaling and credentialing, and it has very little to do with learning, development, and even real world success. Peter Gray also writes about the negative impact the system is having on our children. He argues that children are unhappier today than they have ever been in history. He talks a lot about how childhood used to be very different around 50 years ago. Children used to have a lot of freedom and they used to play a lot more. There was much less standardized testing and after school classes and all this crazy stuff that goes on today. And he talks about how today's system is creating a whole bunch of mental health problems. Peter Gray gives us solid data to prove these points. The data is from the US, but I have no doubt that it would be the same trend worldwide. He discusses data from two different tests that have been administered to students since the 1950s. These tests show that anxiety and depression have increased continuously, linearly, and dramatically over the years. In fact, the differences are so great that 5 to 8 times more students today are above the cutoff for anxiety and depression. A separate group of researchers came up with the following table for kids aged 14 to 16. Kids are not getting enough rest. About half of them are feeling a great deal of tension. A third of them see life as a strain. The suicide rate for kids under the age of 15 has gone up 4 times. So the next time you think, oh, school, it's just how it is, I hope these numbers remind you that there's something gravely wrong with our system of education. Studies show that children who felt most pressured by their parents to achieve in school and were most frequently shuttled from one extracurricular activity to another were the most likely to feel anxious or depressed. There was another interesting study of students from grades 6 through 12, which showed that the lowest levels of happiness by far occurred when the kids were in school, and the highest levels occurred when they were out of school conversing or playing with friends. We have created a world in which children must suppress their natural instincts to take charge of their own education and instead mindlessly follow paths to nowhere laid for them by adults. How did we come to the conclusion that the best way to educate students is to force them into settings where they are bored, unhappy, and anxious? Our system of education is deeply broken and we need to find a better way.